Thank you for having me. I'm just going to start my presentation. That's always a bit tricky. Keep in mind that I'm only a simple legal advisor. And then I'm going to start my camera again. I hope you can see me now. Thank
yes,
you.
we can
right.
see your face. Yes.
Excellent. So thank you for having me, and greetings to everyone. Good afternoon if you're in Korea. Good morning if you're in Europe, Sweden, where I'm situated. So my name is Henrik Tanfors, and I'm chair of the Mass Working Group for Safety and Security Matters at the IMO. Today I thought I'd share some thoughts and insight on the regulatory scoping exercise and its outcome. And so the regulatory scoping exercise broadly, as alluded to by Ernulf, is we're trying to legalize sort of everything that's going on out there in the industry. And it's a challenge, I can tell you that. So today's presentation, I want to start with first, what is the regulatory scoping exercise? Because I think we need, even though we have finalized the scoping exercise, I would still like to share with you some words on why we started it and the scope and the process. But of course, what I want to talk to you about mostly is also the outcome and some words on the next steps at the IMO. We have already started planning I'm sorry, I lost my presentation. Can you see my presentation now? No? All right. Sorry for that. So what is the regulatory scoping exercise? Well, it started in 2017. The Maritime Safety Committee, the committee at the IMO dealing with safety and security matters, agreed to have an agenda item for this. And the reason for that being, of course, that we felt that the industry was pushing and there was a real momentum starting to gain in certain countries. So we felt the need to address that momentum, and also being the global regulator, of course, we knew that everyone was counting on us to get something done in this regard. So the scoping exercise basically consists of two steps. So what we did, we scoped, we read through thousands and thousands of regulations, trying to find out what regulations in the big conventions that apply or doesn't apply to mass as defined. And if those regulations or provisions preclude mass operations as they were currently drafted. The second step was to analyze the best way to address mass operations. So that's the analyze part and step 2 of the exercise. A very interesting part of the exercise was also to identify common gaps and common themes. And I will speak more about these common gaps and themes briefly. But the common gaps and themes are problems, barriers that are horizontally found throughout all or some of the IMO instruments. And if we can find solution to those common gaps and themes, for example, the role and responsibility of the master, how do we handle that capacity in a regulation of the future, and if we address those issues, we can solve problems, similar problems or the identical problems in many conventions at the same time. So that was also a surplus part of the scoping exercise. The mass definition, as I'm sure you're aware, and I've seen examples from industry using not maybe the same definition, but different varieties of it. And it's very broad and generic, as you can see on the screen. A ship which to a varying degree can operate independent of human interaction. And that's not sufficient, of course, if you want to conduct a scoping exercise and analyze a lot of provisions. So we had to come up with these degrees of autonomy, and we agreed to have 4 degrees of autonomy. The first one being a ship with automated processes and decision support. That's something very close to the conventional ship of today, but with a higher degree of automation than that's available today. And then we have 2 degrees where we have remotely piloted or controlled ships, the first being with seafarers on board. And then we have the 3rd degree with seafarers not being on board, and that's when it becomes a bit more tricky. And of course, the 4th degree where we have the fully autonomous ship, and that's a whole different game, of course. Just a final slide on the scoping exercise itself. I just want to show you the actual scope, and it was a massive task. We had 13 something conventions, and the SOLAS convention, being the most central convention, was divided into a variety of small splinter groups covering each chapter. So this was a gargantuan task performed by the IMO member states, individual member states. So it wasn't done by me as the chair. I merely tried to facilitate the work and get the group into making the right decisions. But it was the actual member states doing the heavy lifting in this exercise. And so the ones on the left are the MSC instruments, and there are also 19 codes additional. And then we also have in red the instruments from the legal committee and the facilitation committee. They have also finalized their exercises. And above you see MARPOL, that's part of the Marine Environment Protection Committee, and they haven't started their exercise yet. But as we know, they are very busy dealing with the climate issue and the climate negotiations. So I think they have, even though MAS is my precious baby in the IMO, I still have some understanding for the Marine Environment Protection Committee not engaging at this stage when they have some very important discussions to deal with. So some words on the outcome of the RSC, the regulatory scoping exercise. What did we find, and what did we recommend for the future? The report in itself it's found in MSC 1 Circ 1638. So we decided to disseminate the report through a circular and thereby making it more easily available for everyone. And it contains we have certain sections of the report that are of special interest. Of course, the section 4 and annex 2 contains the core result of the scoping exercise. In annex 2, you can find the whole result of the scoping exercise for every SOLAS chapter and for every convention that was part of the scoping exercise. So that's a key read if you feel like it. You should also read the result together with the assumptions made. So the individual member state doing the scoping exercise, they had to make assumptions in some cases in order to be able to progress the work. And one assumption could be, for example, that for degree 4, even though it's not stated in degree 4, the fully autonomous ship, that there are no seafarers on board, in some instances, the groups had to make that assumption that there were no seafarers on board, or that there were seafarers on board, for example. And that's important that you read the assumptions together with the final outcome. As I mentioned, we have also identified common potential gaps and themes, and there's a special slide on that further on, so I will not go into that more deeply. But the common gaps and themes were very important for deciding on the high, medium, and the low priority of instruments being scoped. So if there were a lot of common gaps and themes found, for example, in colregs or certain SOLAS chapters, of course, we had to recommend that they were given higher priority for the future, meaning that we have to deal with those instruments with the priority when we start drafting or amending instruments or start drafting a new instrument. The same goes for the high priority issues. We also had a section on, a part of the section just highlighting that certain issues need to be dealt with first. For example, the role and responsibility of the master. And for the degrees 2 and 3, of course, remote operator, the role and responsibility of the remote operator. And of course also whether and how we end up with a mass code or a mass instrument, which is the last part in this slide. So that's a very important part of the outcome that we recommend that the IMO draft a single instrument for mass. We don't, and that it should be holistic and goal-based in its approach. And as Ernulf mentioned, goal-based, it's I'm not going to say that it's trending, but it's more complicated and complex than I think everyone understands. So that's also something we need to take care of before we start drafting. Do we really understand the actual implication of having a goal-based instrument? Just a little bit on the most appropriate ways of addressing. There were 4 possible ways, and the first one, of course, being that we don't see a need to amend the instrument. We can use equivalences using the 1455 process, etc. So the second and third, of course, amending existing instruments or developing a new instrument, that's sort of the core business that we will have to deal with in the upcoming days, or the upcoming sessions of MSc. So just a very brief, this is based on the Swedish preparations for an MSc meeting, what we found. And as Solus, you can see the yellow and red parts, that's where we have the real issues and barriers, where we need to amend the instruments or where we feel that there is even more appropriate to have a new instrument altogether. And it's the heavy technical convention, SOLAS, of course, but also for some other conventions, load lines, tonnage, and also Colorex being there. But for Colorex and STCW, we also feel that there might be a possibility of having equivalences solutions to the barriers found in those more human-centric conventions. And as you know, or you might not know, STCW, the standards for training and certification and watchkeeping, the manning of the ships and the qualifications of the personnel, it usually comes last. So I think we foresee STCW being the last convention to be addressed, even though it's a very important and of high priority. Usually STCW comes last after we have decided on carriage requirements or new roles being introduced in the SOLAS conventions, for example. So some words on the common gaps and themes, as mentioned. These are very important features of the scoping exercise, and they will be very important for the subsequent work being done at the IMO. And I mentioned remote control station, remote operator as a seafarer, meaning of master, crew, or responsible person. They are very central, of course, to the future work. But also any provision containing manual operations, any provision where the regulator foresaw a human taking action. And this is quite a good list to use as we continue also planning for the upcoming work. And planning is what we need to do because we have, as I mentioned, we also identified priorities going forward, and we need an output. We have an output now, and we also agreed that we should consider a holistic approach going forward, and that's the development of a mass instrument. And we also need to look into the definition of mass again. Do we need to have supplementary terminology for a regulatory framework of mass? Probably. And we also, I think Ernulf has a very good point there that goal-based standards or regulations depend on verified standards that you need to apply and comply with in order to fulfill the goals in the goal-based standard. So there's also something we need to adhere to and consider. How do we need to engage in discussions and liaison with other international bodies or organizations of standard organizations? And I mentioned again the high priority common gaps and themes. We need to take those on board and continue discussing and consider how do we deal with the issue of master when the bridge is ashore. Remote bridge, there are certain functions you need to perform still, and of course certain certain rescue functions, rescuing persons at sea is something you need to consider also. Of course, you can have technical solutions to that, but it's something we need to delve into for the future. Last in this slide, you also see non-mandatory instrument, and that's also something we need to consider. How do we proceed with the non-mandatory instrument? Some IMO member states feel that non-mandatory instrument could be beneficial in the meantime, in the interim between now and when we have a mandatory instrument in place. Do we, as the global regulator, need to put out guidelines or a non-mandatory code for industry and states to apply in order for mass to move forward, even in the meantime? So that's also something we will look into. I mentioned briefly that the FAL and the LEG committee, facilitation committee, as Ernulf also referred to, they play a key role keeping administration and to a minimum, and also facilitating now with the digitalized regime of exchanging information. It's going to be very important, of course, super important in the future where we have perhaps no manning on board, no master on board to handle the exchange of information. For those committees and their regulations, standalone mass code was not the immediate focus for some aspects perhaps, but that was not the main conclusion for those exercises. But they have some priority common gaps and themes that are the same as MSC. And that's, of course, the master, the remote operator, terminology, definition, certificates and other documents. How do we handle that in an unmanned context, for example? So some words on the next steps, and this is where it gets interesting, of course. We need to get MEPC involved, and as I said, MEPC are burdened with some very heavy and important discussions on the climate. But we need to get them involved to get the full picture. And I mean, just MARPOL and its 6 annexes contain a number of barriers or issues we need to analyze. MAC, the committee where my working group is situated, we are working now actually on a roadmap intersessionally, trying to identify all the policy decisions we need to make and all issues we need to discuss before we can start drafting a code. So we need to have a clear picture of some heavy policy decisions we need to take as a committee before we can continue on the fun stuff. And I mean, on the fun, of course, being creative and producing an instrument that industry and flag states can use when they produce and approve the mass. We also need to increase knowledge, and this is something I point to all the time, as this conference is very important in that regard, and other conferences, and of course also having government industry groups together and informing each other on what's happening in the industry, and member states or administrations informing industry what's happening on the administrative level. Trials experience is also very important. When you conduct trials, make sure that you inform of course, your administration, I guess that's apparent, but also the IMO and other interested bodies, because we need to know what we are going to regulate. And if we don't get information from reality, it's going to be, the risk is that we're going to end up with a bad product. So we need information, share information. That's very important. Activity, finally, I think that's the most important. That's the most important part, to keep momentum in the mass movement. So as I mentioned, we have a new output at MSC, and that's an agenda item. So we have the possibility now to continue working, and the output is developing a goal-based instrument for maritime autonomous surface ships with a target completion year of 2025. Well, that's very optimistic. So this is, I just want to manage your expectations. 2025 might be a bit optimistic, but this is also something we need to consider when we produce our roadmap. That's going to be the first step. Code and regulations will come after that. We need to make policy decisions first. So summing up, we have completed the RSC. All ongoing RSCs are completed. MSCs is found in MSC Circus 1638. The other scoping exercises from the legal committee and the facilitation committee will also be circulated, I'm sure. Keeping in mind that this was a high-level exercise, even though we delved through all regulations and provisions, the analysis, the conclusions were made on an instrument level. We are waiting for MEPC, sorry, but we have started our work at MSC now, as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. Producing a roadmap will be our first priority. And that's something that's ongoing, and we will, of course, also involve all the submitters for new outputs at the last session. Also, the interim guidelines are in effect. As I said, use them, share your experience. That's very important for us as a regulator to know every feature that could have an implication for the regulation. So be active, share information, and if you feel nationally that there is not enough momentum in your administration or at the government level, be active and contact your MP or your government or any decision maker, and make them aware that mass needs to be regulated. That's the most important step to make it possible. And by saying that, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for having me at this conference. And if you have any questions about the Swedish system or the IMO work, feel free to contact me at any time. I will try to answer as good as possible. So I wish you a great remainder of the day, and thank you.